Americans are generally split on whether they're concerned the IRS will increase audits, according to a new Morning Consult Politico poll, with 45% of respondents saying they are very concerned and 56% saying they're not at all concerned.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre pledged to reporters that the 80,000 new agents hired as part of the Inflation Reduction Act will conduct no new audits on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. Let's watch.
Who around here decided that Americans were crying out for more interaction with the IRS?
I don't understand your question. You have to say more.
Do you think it's going to be popular when the 87,000 new employees hired by the IRS go around and start auditing people to pay for the Inflation Reduction Act?
So it's very clear. The IRS commissioner was very clear on this. He said that on the record that this will only apply to those earning over $400,000. This is not about folks who make less than $400,000.
So no new audits on anybody making under $400,000 a year?
Very clear, no.
Joining us now to weigh in is Associate Editor at Reason Magazine, Liz Wolfe. Welcome back to Rising, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
So you probably, like myself, see IRS audits in our nightmares, and I have to imagine you have some concerns about this hiring move.
Well, I mean, the good news is they're gun rights supporters. You know, there's a whole bunch of armed IRS agents who carry guns. But the bad news is, yeah.
Right,
I mean,
because you're talking about the applications for these. Go into that.
Yeah, I mean, these are armed agents of the state, ultimately, at the end of the day. No, but I think we have a lot of reason to be very skeptical of the claim that audits or audit rates won't increase for the poorest among us. When you look at the way the IRS sort of currently performs, one of the big things they do is correspondence audits. So these are basically mail-in audits. They're typically assigned to pretty low-level, unskilled agents, and they typically target earned income tax credit recipients. So people at the very, very bottom of the income hierarchy, households making $20,000 a year or less. ProPublica has actually done some really interesting research, and they found that I believe in 2018 and 2019, the audit rates of households making over $5 million a year and the audit rates of households making under $20,000 a year were actually converging. Those audit rates were becoming very similar over time. So I think it would be foolish for us to assume that drastically increasing IRS manpower wouldn't fall on the poorest among us.
So Liz, it is absolutely a significant issue that the overwhelming majority of audits are targeting people of low-income backgrounds. When you look at maps comparing a map of where low-income people live and where audits take place, that is absolutely true. The purpose of this new IRS funding is, in fact, to rectify that. The number of employees being hired, there is this implication that they're all auditors that are being hired, but only a fraction of those are actual auditors. It's a lot of tech support and other kinds of things that are supposed to bring the staffing up to where it was about 10 years ago before the IRS was defunded by conservatives. In the last 10 years, since the IRS was defunded by conservatives and the number of auditors shrank, this is a quote, the largest corporations in the United States with over 20 billion of assets have their audit rate go from nearly 100% to 50%. So the rich people are being audited less as we had fewer resources in the IRS. That's from Janet Holtzblatt, a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. She goes on to say, among wealthy individuals who had a positive income of $1 million or more, the audit rate fell from 8.4% in 2010 to 2.4% in 2019. So my question to you is this an indication that actually hiring more support for the IRS, you could bring the audit rate of those affluent people back up to where it was a number of years ago and have the resources to keep them from focusing on lower level, lower income people who have the easier cases?
Well, a few things to that point. One, I think it's really worth it to be specific when we talk about defunding a specific agency. This is something that I think conservatives need to be more charitable on when they're talking about the left, because so often they say, you know, the left wants to defund the police, when in reality, that's not a very accurate and honest representation of what people on the left are trying to do. So I also want to apply that same sort of intellectual consistency and honesty to the IRS budget being slashed. It was not totally entirely defunded, but you are correct that conservatives have, in general, over the last 10 years, slashed the budget, I believe, to the tune of 30% or something like that. So I just want to be precise with the degree to which something has been defunded, because I think this is something that people on both left and right frequently get wrong, and it makes our politics more toxic when we are imprecise about that. I do think your point that they will not, that the IRS won't solely hire agents who will be conducting correspondence audits and in fact might be able to better focus their resources and better allocate time and talent. That's a fair one, and that very well could be the case. One thing that the IRS has mentioned that I think a lot of conservatives have missed or misrepresented is that, some amount of manpower will allegedly be devoted toward customer service and improving people's access to getting an IRS agent on the phone and actually explaining the process and making it so that they're interfacing with government agents in a much more efficient and better way where they can actually get their questions answered. So I want to be very clear, that is a possible outcome of this huge hiring push. There is also some opportunity for the IRS to be better at allocating the agents that they currently have and to do a better job of sort of refocusing. And since this is all in the limelight, choosing not to emphasize those correspondence audits that are hitting the poorest people, but instead trying to really focus on the highest earners. That is very well something they could do. But again, we have to consider that the richest people are those who hire teams and teams of lawyers and accountants and are historically very good at finding oftentimes legal loopholes to evade taxation. And so I think it's important to consider how this is going to realistically play out in the world that we currently live in. And I think we have really good evidence from the last 10 years to indicate that that might be the case.
Well, an Associated Press fact check of critics of the Inflation Reduction Act took the side of Democrats on the issue. Fact checkers say the 80,000 new agents will not target middle-class taxpayers, citing a lawyer for the Treasury Department as their source. Which, right, look, I think there's some degree to which we don't know exactly what the impact of this will be. It could honestly be, from my perspective, that the bureaucracy just absorbs this new influx of employees and enforcement doesn't change in either direction as much as anyone expects because there's not a whole amount of, a lot of accountability for it.
Of course, there's a certain unknown built into everything, but we do have evidence from what happens when 10 years ago we had the number of employees that are being funded and advocated for now. And back then, 10 years ago, before these cuts happened, we had rich people being audited at double the rates they're being audited now. That's what we know. So more agents historically has literally meant within the last 10 years, double on the rich people and not the consequences on the poor people that people are talking about right now. So it is a little confusing why the presumption seems to be, and I understand why people have concerns and people should be, there should be transparency and all of that. But it's a little confusing to me why there is this presumption that by restoring the agency to the point it was 10 years ago, you won't also be restoring the doubling of audits on the affluent. And I also don't understand why there isn't more scrutiny about why it is that conservatives are pushing a defunding of the IRS when they quite obviously, the affluent corporate elites that are pushing for these policies aren't quite obviously pushing for policies that benefit themselves as the affluent people in those kind of tax brackets.
To be frank, in bogging down the wealthy in audits as well. It's harder for working class people and
poor people, but
you just
made the point that they have a lot of money to avoid their taxes, and that's the point here, is that they're not trying to bother them.
I don't
trying to be
fetishize
harassed.
the paying of taxes in general. We should reform the system, lower the tax burden for everyone, make it simpler.
I mean, this is a topic I've covered pretty extensively for a reason. We can sort of talk about the category of the working rich, the households making $400,000 a year. Honestly, we're in the midst of like a physician shortage right now. We're in the midst of a pilot shortage. In terms of how we want to incentivize or disincentivize hardworking people who are less likely to be welfare recipients, I think there is actually a fairly good case to be made. And of course, I feel this way. I'm a libertarian for trying not to hit households making $400,000 a year with incredibly cumbersome audits. I mean, these are people who, in general, have greater access to lawyers and accountants who can help them find the most advantageous way to take advantage of their situation. But I think it's also worth considering that, maybe we don't want to be super punitive toward them. Maybe we don't want to be bogging them down with a ton of audits. I think it's fair to say, okay, well, how many people will be disincentivized from pursuing the professions that they want in the long run if they know that those are ultimately going to be things where more and more of their money gets taxed away and potentially they're targeted for audits at a much higher degree.
Well,
I'm not really sure that we want to be targeting the poor,
Yeah.
and I'm not really sure we want to be targeting the working rich. Probably all of us qualify as the working rich to some degree. Lots of people
I do not
who are
make $400,000 a year, but I will say, and even
not
in
at that-
pilots,
not at
I
that
will
level.
say.
But I'm saying like successful people in media and journalism, and especially a dual income, dual earning household, it's really not that hard for highly educated people. We were talking before this segment about how you went to Harvard Law. How many of your Harvard Law classmates, 10 years down the road?
They should absolutely pay their taxes. The question here isn't whether or not people should be punitive or punished or harassed by an agency. The question is whether or not people who, to a point both of you have both made repeatedly, have the means to avoid their taxes and hire lawyers. Brilliant. Hire lawyers.
But you're just talking in your radar about how.
Wait a minute. If I could just finish this point, they are able to exactly do what you guys say and hire professionals to allow them to pay not their fair share, while poor and working people are paying disproportionately large parts of their salaries. They should the focus of the IRS should be on them and preclude them from being able to do this. This is not a punitive effort. This is an effort to get people to literally pay what they are owed under the government. And whether or not you believe in taxation, if we're all having to pay taxes, they shouldn't have to pay less taxes than the rest of us just because they have more money and resources.
The way to change that should be through eliminating the current legal loopholes that exist.
Agreed.
Not via this newly empowered audit army.
I think both need to happen, and the tax code needs to be simplified as well.
I think the mechanism by which this is done matters, and I have a lot of problems with the mechanism that's being proposed, which is hiring 87,000 additional IRS agents.
They're not agents. We got to be careful about that. It's IRS employees.
Okay.
It's not agents.
Some unknown
Tech,
number
computers,
of
those kinds of things. Yeah.
Some unknown number. I mean, I was advocating for being precise about talking about defunding earlier. Like, I think it's important for our precision to go both ways.
And I
frankly.
appreciate that.
But I mean, let's be very clear about this. This is not the appropriate mechanism for which this to be done. And frankly, legislators are obfuscating on the point of the degree to which this will be targeting households earning $400,000 or less per year. There was a provision, sort of considered a fig leaf provision, in one of the earlier drafts of this legislation, which was voted down in the amendment process. And so now people are sort of wondering, okay, well, what exactly is the current status of this? Because, Biden's press secretary keeps saying one thing, but that provision has actually been removed from the legislation. So why are they saying one thing, but then doing something different in the actual bill? I think it's really important to resolve those things about the degree to which households making $400,000 a year will be targeted by the newly hired IRS employees.
So that there's a provision that specifically says what? That the rate of auditing in that bracket will remain consistent, and that was removed?
There had been a provision saying that the intention is not to increase the audit rate or the number of audits in that bracket, and that was included in the Senate draft, I believe, but then it was removed upon further review and is now no longer present, and yet people keep claiming that conservatives are overreacting for being confused and concerned about this. There's a little bit of an inconsistency, and I think people would be well served by being very clear about what they're trying to do, because we're working through the democratic process, and it's important to actually understand what's in this legislation. So that's the concern that I have, and I would appreciate clarity from the Biden administration on that.
Well, Liz Wolfe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
More Rising right after this.